There is a book about Larry Ellison called Software, written by a journalist named Matthew Simmons, who traveled with Ellison for 2 years and had access to him in a way that almost no writer ever has. The book includes Ellison's own annotations, footnotes written in his own words in response to what the author wrote. He could not change anything, he could only add his own perspective. What you get from reading it is something unusual, the unfiltered mind of a man who built one of the most valuable software companies in history, talking openly about his failures, his character, his fears, and what actually drove him. This is what I found. Ellison is his own harshest critic. A significant portion of this book is Ellison being embarrassed by his own performance as CEO of Oracle for the first 15 years of the company's existence. He does not make excuses, he does not deflect. He says repeatedly, "I was incompetent. I didn't know what I was doing. I was doing only the things that interested me and ignoring the rest. The same problem I had in school, but this happened in my 40s. I was not a kid anymore." He combines this brutal self-assessment with something that makes it useful rather than just uncomfortable. He describes exactly what he did wrong and why, which means you can learn from it without having to make the same mistakes yourself. He is naturally, almost constitutionally, contrarian. In the late 1990s, technology analysts and investment banks were confidently predicting the maturity of the database market. The internet, they said, would end Oracle's growth. Ellison looked at the same facts and concluded the opposite. The internet would not shrink the database market. It would exponentially increase both the number of database transactions and the number of people interacting with Oracle's databases. He was right. They were wrong. This is a pattern that runs through his entire career. He is only truly comfortable when he believes something that almost nobody else believes, and acts on that belief in a significant way. He says, "I pick the highest risk approach only when I think it will increase our chance of winning. And whenever you travel an untraveled path, there is going to be risk." He burned the boats on internet applications at a time when his own senior colleagues thought he was being reckless to the point of insanity. He says about the people who disagreed, they were mistaking the present for the future. It is the worst mistake a technology company can make. Client server was dead, and the people in the room would figure it out at the funeral. By then it would be too late for Oracle to change course. He is not a grinder, he is a sprinter. By his own admission, Ellison never really wanted to be a CEO. He never really wanted to run a company. He would alternate between apathetic indifference and complete obsession, depending on what was happening inside Oracle at any given moment. He says, "I'm a sprinter. I rest. I sprint. I rest. I sprint." He is easily bored. He spent extended periods away from Oracle, leaving operations to senior colleagues. He is simultaneously criticized for being too dominant and too detached, depending on who is doing the criticizing. What he is genuinely exceptional at is identifying the right direction and communicating it with enough clarity and conviction that other people believe it too. He says, "I've always believed that selling software is a secondary objective. What's far more important is to recruit believers." He is a phenomenal storyteller. When you watch him speak, even now in his early 80s, the clarity is remarkable. Simple messages, repeated relentlessly, delivered with infectious enthusiasm. He founded Oracle in 1976. He was 34 years old. His original goal was to build a company doing about $10 million a year in revenue and employing about 50 people. What motivated him, he says, was the desire to control his own environment, so he wouldn't have to do things he didn't want to do or spend time with people he didn't enjoy working with. He and his 2 co-founders were looking for a product to build. They scoured the technical literature. IBM's research division had published papers about a prototype relational database. Ellison decided to use those papers as an architectural blueprint. The opportunity was enormous. No one else was even trying. He liked the fact that it was risky. He says, "The bigger the apparent risk, the fewer people will try to go there. We would surely lose if we faced serious competition, but if we were alone in pursuit of our goal, we had a chance to win." The first version of the database was called Oracle version 2. He had deliberately skipped version 1. He says, I didn't think anyone would buy version 1 of a database from 5 guys in California. The first customer was the CIA, then Navy intelligence, then Air Force intelligence, then the NSA. For the first decade and a half, Ellison ran Oracle through what he calls extreme delegation. Others called it abdication. He was interested in technology. He was not interested in sales, accounting, or legal. If he wasn't interested in something, he simply ignored it. The result was a sales organization with no effective controls, no oversight, and a set of incentive structures that were actively working against the company. Salespeople would offer massive discounts to get customers to buy software they didn't need yet. They would book multi-year contracts up front and recognize the revenue immediately for software that wouldn't be delivered or paid for months or years, in many cases, never paid for at all. Customers figured out that the best time to negotiate was the last day of the quarter. In 1991, it caught up with him. Oracle had to restate earnings. The stock dropped by more than 80%. The company was weeks away from collapse. Ellison says, "What kind of CEO lets salespeople write their own contracts? I just didn't know any better. I was doing only the things that interested me. You cannot run a company without strong checks and balances. I wasn't paying proper attention to my job." He also describes a hiring mistake that stayed with him. He had promoted someone to CFO based primarily on the fact that the man was intelligent. When a colleague challenged this, he said something that stopped Ellison cold. "Yeah, Larry, he's very smart, but can he do his job?" Ellison says, "I just stared at him and said nothing. But I was thinking, he's right. Brilliance is not enough." Even as Oracle was nearly going under, Ellison refused to sell equity. He found creative alternatives instead. He secured an $80 million loan from a Japanese company on favorable terms by giving them warrants to buy a stake in Oracle Japan. He was doing whatever it took to avoid diluting his ownership position. The reason was personal as much as financial. His adopted father had told him throughout his childhood that he would never amount to anything. Every time Oracle was in crisis, that voice came back. He says, "I couldn't give up. I had to save Oracle to save myself. I couldn't run away. I've always been more motivated by fear of failure than by greed. I hate to lose." And then he adds something that has stayed with me. Silicon Valley is a killing field. Very few technology companies survive, and we did. Once he had fixed the sales organization, he turned his attention to the rest of the business. What he found everywhere he looked was complexity, duplication, and processes that nobody had actually thought through. He describes Oracle as organized like medieval Europe. He was a weak king surrounded by strong, fiercely independent dukes. He would make policy decisions in California, which his dukes promptly ignored. The pricing process was his favorite example. A pricing committee would decide to charge $10,000 per processor. The global sales team would receive this decision, redo their own analysis, and reset the price to $20,000. That price would go to European headquarters in Geneva, where another team would redo the analysis and reset it to $15,000. That would go to Germany, where it would be reset again to $25,000. Every country had a different price. 200 people around the world were involved in analyzing and reanalyzing, setting and resetting prices. They ended up competing against themselves. His solution was to ask why repeatedly. Whenever he uncovered a process that seemed wasteful or absurd, he would just keep asking why until he found the actual reason, or confirmed there wasn't one. He says, "We had 70 separate HR systems, each with their own database. To find out how many people worked at Oracle, you had to look into 70 separate databases. If we had one, we would know. But we had 70. Now 70 HR systems cost a lot more than one HR system, so we were paying extra to not know. Why are we doing that?" He describes this as data everywhere and not a drop of information. He also learned to ask simpler questions and be suspicious of people who tried to avoid answering them. He required every business unit to answer 4 questions for budget planning. How much did you sell last year? How much are you going to sell this year? How much did you spend last year? How much are you going to spend this year? One senior manager came into a meeting with 200 slides. Ellison said, "I've got 4 questions. Once you've answered them, I'll look at however many slides you want." The manager was offended. He thought it was very important for Ellison to look at his slides first. He deliberately chose his enemies. Instead of having Oracle compared to other database companies, which would have positioned Oracle as one among many, he picked a fight with Microsoft and IBM. He made Oracle synonymous with those two names. If you were thinking about enterprise software, you were now thinking about Oracle alongside the two most dominant companies in the industry. He says, "We pick our enemies very carefully. It helps us focus. We can't explain what we do unless we compare it to someone who does it differently. We don't know if we're gaining or losing unless we constantly compare ourselves to the competition." The media loved the fight. Ellison got the cover of Fortune magazine. Oracle's products went along for the ride. He also had a clear view on the alternative. He says, "Everybody was scared of Microsoft. People would compare them to a dangerous alligator and say, maybe we should be nice to the alligator. My view, what if we just kill the alligator before it kills us? Being nice to the alligator will never work. If you're a fighter, the only way up is through the top fighters in your division." His description of Bill Gates is one of the most interesting passages in the book. He describes a 5-hour phone call during which Gates thought through a technical disagreement, called back in the afternoon, admitted Ellison was right, and immediately moved to the next point. Ellison says, "Most people hate to admit they're wrong, but it didn't bother Bill one bit. All he cared about was what was right, not who was right. That is what makes Bill very, very dangerous. If Bill has to choose, he would rather win the war than win the argument." He hired Safra Catz, who would eventually become CEO, specifically to compensate for his own weaknesses. She describes his most important trait as the ability to think without walls. He describes hers as discipline and thoroughness that he does not possess himself. He says, "I'm pretty good at separating good ideas from bad ideas, and I'm pretty good at drilling into detail and solving problems. But once a problem is understood and a plan is in place, I usually move on to the next thing rather than following up to make sure the plan is actually implemented. That's called execution, and Safra is brilliant at it." The most important insight he had about himself as a leader is that he was doing only what interested him, and that this was not enough. He applied engineering discipline to product development. He eventually understood he needed to apply the same discipline to every process in the company: marketing, sales, service, finance. He says, "I'm still an engineer at heart, but now I apply engineering thinking to the entire business, not just to the product." He ends the book with a few ideas that I think are the most important things he says. On motivation. "I've always been more motivated by fear of failure than greed. Whenever I got too close to a goal, I'd raise the bar for fear of actually clearing it. We are endlessly curious about our own limits." On what drives him. "I just cannot accept defeat until I've been carried dead from the field. I have a lot of endurance, intellectual, emotional, and physical." The software business is a difficult test. It is a high-stakes game with a lot of people playing. It is a lot more interesting and a lot more exciting because of that. If I wasn't doing this, I'm not sure what else I'd be doing with my life. And then the last thought, which I keep returning to. He says, "What we want to do with our lives is the most important question we all have to answer. I think if I found out I was dying and had a year to live, I wouldn't change my life very much." That is the test. Not wealth, not status, not what other people think of what you are building. The test is whether, if you knew your time was almost gone, you would keep doing what you are doing. For Larry Ellison, after 50 years of Oracle, the answer is yes.